What if progress isn't just a story of discovery, but of forgetting? For every invention that changed the world, there are others that vanished quietly, leaving behind only whispers, sketches, and the faint smell of burnt paper. History, we like to think, moves forward in straight lines, each breakthrough building upon the last. But sometimes it folds in on itself, erasing paths that might have led somewhere else entirely. In the archives of science and invention, there are missing pages, ideas that were too strange, too ambitious, or perhaps too disruptive to survive. This is not a story about conspiracy. It's a story about human nature, about the uneasy relationship between discovery and power, between curiosity and control. Every era chooses what it remembers and what it quietly sets aside. Imagine a man standing beneath a steel tower taller than the trees, its spire humming faintly with the sound of the earth itself. Another bends over a microscope, watching invisible life shimmer and pulse like constellations under glass. One tunes an engine not with wrenches, but with musical notes. Another whispers to magnetic fields, learning how to lift stone as if it were weightless. These are not scenes from fiction. They belong to real people, brilliant, eccentric, flawed, who once believed they were standing at the edge of a new age. Each held in their hands a vision that promised to transform how humanity lived, healed, traveled, and understood the world. And one by one, those visions disappeared. Some were lost to bureaucracy, others to ridicule or fear. Some were buried under the word classified. A few simply died with their inventors, dreams too delicate to outlive their makers. Yet in every case there remains the haunting possibility that the world we know might have been profoundly different had those ideas been allowed to breathe. The stories that follow are not accusations, they are meditations on the fragile balance between imagination and authority, and on the cost of progress measured not in dollars or patents, but in forgotten wonder. Because what's erased from history doesn't always vanish. Sometimes it lingers, waiting in blueprints, in rumors, in the corners of forgotten laboratories where dust glitters like the residue of unspent potential. As we move through these stories, from the lightning of Tesla's towers to the quiet hum of machines that claim to heal, from levitating metals to ships that slip through the folds of time, we aren't merely tracing inventions. We're tracing a question. Who decides what becomes possible? Perhaps the measure of civilization isn't how much it invents, but how much it can bear to let exist. So let us begin, not with certainty, but with curiosity, not with proof, but with the pulse of wonder that first drives all discovery. This is the story of 10 inventions said to have been erased from history, not as a catalog of what was, but as a mirror reflecting what might have been. A journey through forgotten laboratories, quiet exiles, and minds that glimpsed something beyond the accepted map of reality. In the flicker of lost experiments, we may not find absolute truth, but we might rediscover something far more human, our endless capacity to dream, and the quiet, dangerous courage it takes to imagine differently. It began with a sound, low, rhythmic, almost alive. On a windswept stretch of Long Island in 1899, a steel tower rose toward the clouds, its copper dome shimmering with the residue of distant storms. Beneath it, a man paced through a forest of coils and glass tubes, his dark coat whipping in the static air. His name was Nikola Tesla, and he believed he could make the earth itself sing. Tesla called it the Wardenclyffe Tower, but he spoke of it as if it were a living being, an extension of the planet's nervous system. The idea was simple, audacious, and centuries ahead of its time: to draw energy from the invisible fields that flow through space and transmit it wirelessly, freely to anyone, anywhere on Earth. No fuel, no smoke, no wires, only the pulse of the planet itself. At first it worked. Witnesses spoke of lamps glowing miles away, untouched by any cord. Motors turned without a sound. The air itself seemed to hum with invisible current. Tesla called it radiant energy, a force he claimed filled every corner of the cosmos, waiting only for resonance, the right frequency, to awaken it. For a moment it seemed humanity stood at the threshold of limitless power. But then came silence. His financier, J.P. Morgan, saw both the brilliance and the danger. "If anyone can draw on the power," he reportedly asked, "where do we put the meter?" The question was more than rhetorical. It was fatal. Funding vanished. The tower's hum faded. Within 2 years, the project was dismantled, its metal skeleton left to rust like a monument to impossible ambition. When Tesla died in 1943, government agents seized his trunks, over 80 of them, filled with notebooks, blueprints, and calculations written in his spidery hand. Officially, they were taken for national security. Unofficially, no one ever saw them again. For decades, rumors flickered in the margins of history that Tesla had succeeded, that he had built a machine capable of tapping the Earth's electrical field itself, that free energy had once been real and then erased. But perhaps the truth is less about theft and more about fear. Free power would have undone the world's machinery. It would have rewritten the economics of nations built on scarcity. The oil fields, the coal trains, the power lines humming across continents, all rendered obsolete by one man's dream of universal abundance. And so the tower fell. Its foundations were sold for scrap. The sky grew quiet again. Yet if you walk the grounds today, there are locals who swear that on certain nights, when the air is wet and the wind moves through the trees just right, you can still feel a faint vibration rising from the soil, like the heartbeat of something buried alive. Tesla once said, "If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration." Perhaps he wasn't speaking only of physics. Perhaps he meant that the universe responds not just to what we build, but to what we believe is possible. And maybe, somewhere between the silence and the storm, that tower still hums, not in the air, but in the imagination of anyone who ever dared to dream of a world lit freely by the invisible breath of the earth. What if disease had a song, and healing was simply a matter of finding the right note? In the 1930s, Dr. Royal Raymond Rife believed he had heard that song. Inside a quiet California laboratory, filled with lenses and humming coils, he built a microscope unlike anything the world had seen. It didn't just magnify. It revealed. Through it, living cells shimmered with color, as if each carried its own pulse of light. Rife claimed that every microorganism had a distinct frequency, a kind of biological signature. Cancer cells, bacteria, viruses, all resonated in their own invisible rhythm. If you could match that rhythm, amplify it, and reflect it back, you could, in theory, shatter the illness without touching the body itself. The principle was poetic, even musical, like an opera singer cracking a crystal glass with the perfect note. Rife's frequency generator sent carefully tuned electromagnetic pulses through the body, gentle waves of energy meant to disrupt only the harmful cells. The healthy ones, untouched, continued to dance in their natural harmony. For a brief, brilliant moment, it worked. In 1934, a quiet clinical trial at the University of Southern California treated 16 terminal cancer patients using Rife's method. Within 70 days, 14 had fully recovered. The remaining 2 improved after their treatment was adjusted. In the records that survived, the language is almost hesitant, as though the researchers themselves couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. But before the results could be published, Dr. Milbank Johnson, who led the study, died suddenly. The files disappeared from university archives, and soon after, Rife's laboratory was raided. His equipment was destroyed, his reputation dismantled. The American Medical Association declared his methods fraudulent. Journals refused his papers. Doctors who supported him lost their licenses. A few spoke out anyway, then fell silent, some through intimidation, some through exhaustion. By 1939, Rife was alone. The very technology that might have rewritten the story of disease had been recast as heresy. He spent the rest of his life defending his work in courtrooms rather than laboratories, his machines confiscated or hidden away. There are those who believe his invention was suppressed by pharmaceutical interests, that a cure so elegant and inexpensive could not coexist with an industry built on perpetual treatment. Others argue that Rife simply overreached, that his observations were more mystical than measurable. Perhaps both are true. Innovation is never born in a vacuum. It emerges within systems that decide what kind of hope is acceptable. And sometimes the most dangerous discovery is not what a machine can do, but what it might make us question about the world we've built around illness and profit. When asked, years later, whether he still believed his device could heal, Rife's answer was quiet. "Everything vibrates," he said. "If you know the rhythm of life, you can change it." That rhythm, it seems, was too radical for its time, and yet the idea never completely died. Decades later, engineers and healers alike still experiment with sound, light, and resonance, searching for that elusive frequency that could tip the balance from decay back toward harmony. Science has moved on, or perhaps it has circled back. But somewhere in a forgotten lab filled with the ghost light of glass tubes, you can almost imagine the sound, a hum that feels both mechanical and human, the frequency of healing, the music of a possibility we were not ready to hear. What if gravity, the quiet law that keeps us tethered to the ground, wasn't a law at all, but a negotiation? In 1928, a young physicist named Thomas Townsend Brown began to suspect exactly that. Working late into the night with a set of homemade capacitors, simple devices meant to store electrical charge, he noticed something strange. When he applied high voltage, the capacitors moved, not randomly, but in a steady, directed way, toward their positive pole, as if drawn by an invisible hand. It was small at first, almost trivial, but Brown saw a pattern the world had missed. A connection between electricity and gravity. What if electrical charge could lift? What if energy, when shaped correctly, could create thrust without fire or fuel? He called it electrogravitics, the science of controlled anti-gravity. To prove it, he built disc-shaped devices powered by nothing more than charged fields. They hovered, they drifted, and in demonstrations before astonished officials, they flew, without propellers, without engines, without sound. To watch them, witnesses said, was to see the future arrive decades early. By the early 1950s, Brown's work caught the attention of the military. The Air Force saw the potential, silent craft that could hover indefinitely, planes that could accelerate without resistance, spacecraft that might one day cross the void without burning a drop of fuel. Projects with names like Winter Haven and Project Y began appearing in internal memos. Then, just as quickly, the doors closed. In 1956, electrogravitics research was classified under national security orders. Brown's patents were seized. His labs were dismantled. Officially, the explanation was simple. The experiments had failed to produce practical results. But Brown knew better. His discovery had worked too well. There were whispers that aerospace giants, Lockheed, Northrop, Boeing, had incorporated elements of his work into secret military programs. Unmarked hangars in the desert, lights that moved against the wind, technologies that seemed to leap ahead of known physics. Whether those stories were true or not, Brown could no longer speak of them. He had been silenced by the same system that once funded his dreams. He lived the rest of his life in quiet obscurity, his notes scattered, his reputation fading. Yet his conviction never wavered. "Electrogravitics," he once wrote, "will change everything when it's allowed to." And perhaps, in some quiet laboratory, it already did. To believe in Brown's work is to believe that the limits we accept, of weight, of distance, of energy, might be more flexible than we imagine. It's to believe that gravity itself, that most ancient of bonds, might one day be gently persuaded to let us go. But there's something more haunting beneath the science, the way discovery and secrecy dance together. The moment an idea becomes too powerful, it stops belonging to its creator. It becomes property of governments, of industries, of those who see control where others see wonder. In the end, Townsend Brown didn't prove that gravity could be conquered. He proved something subtler, that the boundaries of possibility are often political, not physical. Still, when you look up on a clear night and see a light glide silently across the sky, moving just a little too smoothly, turning against the wind, it's hard not to think of him. Somewhere, perhaps, gravity is still surrendering, briefly, beautifully, to the echo of an experiment that was never supposed to fly. It began not with electricity or magnetism, but with sound. In the late 19th century, John Keely, a self-taught inventor from Philadelphia, claimed that everything in the universe, every atom, every breath, was governed by vibration. To him, music was not art. It was physics made audible. And if one could find the precise harmony of matter itself, one might learn to command it. Keely's laboratory looked less like an engineer's workshop and more like a cathedral of resonance. Glass spheres, tuning forks, and brass instruments lined the walls. Visitors described strange harmoniums and whirring pipes that filled the air with haunting tones. When the machines began to hum, the floor seemed to pulse beneath their feet, as though the entire building were breathing. At the center stood the Keely motor, a device he said drew energy from sympathetic vibration, a force he called the etheric field. It was a concept too abstract for the science of his time, yet strangely prophetic of what later generations would call quantum resonance and zero-point energy. Witnesses swore they saw the impossible. Keely would strike a musical chord, and massive iron spheres would lift as if weightless. Engines ran with no steam, no fuel, only sound. Water spun into motion under invisible pressure. For investors, it was a miracle of industry. For scientists, an affront to thermodynamics. In 1874, the Keely Motor Company was founded, promising an era of limitless, clean power. But what began as a symphony soon devolved into dissonance. When financiers demanded to know how his engine worked, Keely refused. You would not ask a composer to reveal the soul of his songs, he told them. To Keely, the principle was sacred, a harmony between spirit and matter that couldn't be reduced to patents and profits. The refusal was fatal. Funding collapsed, lawsuits followed, and Keely's workshop was raided. After his death in 1898, skeptics claimed to have found hidden air tubes beneath his devices, dismissing his life's work as elaborate theater. Yet others, examining the remnants decades later, saw something more. A system of acoustic resonance and molecular vibration that eerily anticipated technologies still unexplained. Perhaps both were right. Perhaps genius and delusion are not opposites, but neighbors divided by a thin wall of understanding. Keely's tragedy was not only scientific, it was philosophical. He was a man born too early, speaking a language the world had not yet learned to translate. His etheric force may have been metaphor, or insight, or both. In an age obsessed with power and industry, Keely sought something gentler, energy that moved not by violence, but by harmony. His dream was not to conquer nature, but to collaborate with it, to find the note that turns chaos into rhythm. When his laboratory was dismantled, one observer wrote, "It felt as though the instruments were grieving." And perhaps they were. Today, scientists use sound to manipulate matter. Acoustic levitation, sonochemistry, vibration control, concepts that would have sounded like sorcery in Keely's era. Each discovery, in its own quiet way, hums with his echo. Maybe the truth is that Keely didn't invent perpetual motion. Maybe he simply reminded us that motion itself is perpetual, that everything moves, everything sings, and the universe, when listened to closely, still plays the same note he once tried to hold. It started as an accident, one of those strange moments when chaos seems to pause just long enough to show you a secret. In 1979, a Canadian inventor named John Hutchison was tinkering in his small Vancouver apartment, surrounded by salvaged coils, Tesla transformers, and a jumble of radio wave generators. He had no grand theory, just curiosity and an instinct for mischief. What he stumbled upon would later be called the Hutchison effect, a series of physical anomalies so bizarre that they seemed to mock the very laws of nature. Metal bars bent as though made of wax. Wood fused seamlessly into steel. Small objects levitated, trembling in the air as if suspended on invisible strings. Materials changed composition. Brass into a silvery alloy, aluminum into powder. All of it, Hutchison said, came from the chaotic interference of overlapping electromagnetic fields. His living room became a zone of impossible physics. The air thickened with static. Loose bolts and utensils rose and hung mid-air before crashing to the floor. There were witnesses, engineers, scientists, even military officers who saw the events firsthand. It was like watching a matter forget what it was supposed to be, one visitor recalled. Soon word spread. The Canadian government sent observers. The U.S. military followed. Then, as suddenly as it began, the experiment was shut down. In 1990, officials raided Hutchison's workshop, seizing his equipment and classifying the results. The explanation was bureaucratic: national security. The effect, they said, was real but unpredictable, too unstable for civilian study. For the public, it became myth. For Hutchison, it became exile. He kept experimenting in secret, using homemade gear and improvised parts, always chasing that fleeting balance of frequencies that seemed to twist reality itself. Sometimes he succeeded, sometimes he didn't. He would film the levitating metal on VHS tapes, grainy, flickering evidence of a phenomenon that defied replication. Skeptics called it trickery. Supporters called it genius. Hutchison didn't argue. "I just turn on the machines," he said once, "and things happen." To some, that humility was proof of authenticity. To others, proof of madness. Yet even the skeptics couldn't fully explain the videos or the physical samples that bore impossible marks of fusion and transmutation. Something had happened in that cluttered apartment, something neither science nor imagination could comfortably contain. At its heart, the Hutchison effect was not about levitation or magic metals. It was about the intersection of chaos and intention, the way unpredictable systems sometimes reveal patterns too complex to design. Hutchison had built, perhaps by accident, a laboratory version of the universe's own improvisation. In his quieter moments, he spoke not of fame or discovery, but of wonder. "It's like the universe is singing through the equipment," he said. "You just have to listen." If his story sounds like folklore, that might be because science has no easy place for dreamers who blur its edges. Yet, half a century later, researchers studying electromagnetic propulsion and field effects still reference his experiments, carefully, cautiously, as though invoking an unproven ghost. And maybe that's what the Hutchison effect truly was, a ghost of possibility. A glimpse into a world where the boundaries between matter and energy, between the fixed and the fluid, are thinner than we dare admit. Even now, when a spoon trembles on a table or a bolt slips from the hand with a spark of static, one might imagine, just for a heartbeat, that somewhere in the hum of overlapping fields, metals are remembering how to float. What if the very air around us, the invisible space we breathe, was alive with energy we could feel, shape, and heal? In the 1940s, Dr. Wilhelm Reich, an Austrian-born psychiatrist and former student of Freud, believed he had found that energy. He called it orgone, a universal life force that he claimed flowed through everything, humans, clouds, even the empty night sky. To him, illness was not simply biological, but energetic, a blockage, a dam in the river of life itself. Reich's laboratories were filled with curious boxes, chambers made from alternating layers of steel wool, organic fiber, and wood. He called them orgone accumulators. To the untrained eye, they looked like crude saunas, but inside them, patients swore they could feel something, an invisible warmth, a tingling, a pulse. They merged feeling lighter, stronger, somehow more awake. He tested the boxes on animals, plants, even cancer patients. To his astonishment, tumors shrank. Seedlings grew faster. Body temperature inside the accumulators rose slightly, as if something truly were being gathered there, an ambient, unmeasured energy from the world itself. Reich's discoveries didn't stop with the body. He soon turned his gaze upward to the sky. If orgone energy could heal people, he reasoned, could it also heal the atmosphere? He built towering metal tube arrays that reached into the clouds and called them cloudbusters. When he aimed them at the sky, rain followed. When he turned them away, storms dispersed. Farmers wrote to thank him. Meteorologists wrote to condemn him. To the authorities, his claims sounded less like science and more like heresy. By 1947, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration launched an investigation. The government declared orgone energy fictitious, a fantasy that endangered public health. Court orders followed, banning the manufacture and transport of orgone devices. But Reich refused to stop. To deny life energy, he wrote, is to deny life itself. In 1956, agents raided his lab. They smashed the accumulators, seized his notes, and, almost unthinkably, burned his books. Every copy they could find. Decades of research turned to smoke in the Massachusetts sky. The following year, Reich was imprisoned for contempt of court. He died in his cell 8 months later, a man who had tried to capture the vitality of the universe in a box and paid for it with his freedom. To this day, his story divides scholars. Some see a scientist undone by obsession. Others see a visionary silenced for stepping beyond what medicine or government could understand. Modern studies in bioelectromagnetics, psychosomatics, and quantum biology sometimes echo Reich's language without ever saying his name. There's an unease in his legacy, a tension between the measurable and the felt, between the heartbeat and the sky. If you visit the archives of the Wilhelm Reich Museum in Rangeley, Maine, you can still step into an orgone accumulator. The air inside feels still, dense, charged. Some visitors describe warmth, others feel nothing. Yet everyone, for a moment, listens to their pulse, to the silence, to the faint sense that something larger might be listening back. Reich's dream was simple and impossible. That energy, emotion, and weather were all connected, threads in a single breathing web. Perhaps he was wrong, or perhaps he was too right, too early. Because sometimes when clouds gather over an open field and the first drop of rain touches the skin, it's hard not to think of him, the physician who once tried to talk to the sky. It began, as so many mysteries do, with heartbreak. In 1923, a Latvian immigrant named Edward Līdzkalnis arrived in southern Florida, frail and alone. He had been jilted by his fiancée the day before their wedding, and he carried that wound across the ocean. With no family and almost no possessions, he bought a small piece of land near Homestead and began to build something. What he created would one day be called Coral Castle, a fortress of stone carved not from coral, but from oolitic limestone, so dense that each block weighed several tons. Alone, under the Florida moon, Līdzkalnis moved and stacked more than 1,000 of them. No cranes, no heavy machinery, no witnesses. During the day, the site sat silent, but neighbors whispered that at night strange sounds came from behind the high walls, grinding noises, metallic chimes, and once in a while a faint hum that made the air seem to shimmer. On some mornings they would wake to find that new blocks, each weighing as much as a locomotive, had appeared in place, fitted with precision that modern engineers still struggled to explain. When asked how he managed it, Edward would smile faintly. "I understand the secrets of the pyramids," he'd say. "I know the laws that the old builders knew." He spoke often of magnetic currents, forces that flowed through the earth and could be harnessed if one understood their rhythm. His tools were crude: tripods, pulleys, and homemade devices wound with wire and magnets. Yet somehow those primitive instruments obeyed his command. Inside his workshop were odd contraptions, coils of copper, flywheels, and a strange black box he called his perpetual motion holder. He guarded them fiercely. After his death in 1951, government agents and curious scientists entered the property. The devices were gone, removed, or destroyed. No plans were ever found. What remains is the castle itself, a structure both practical and poetic. The stones fit so tightly that not even a blade of grass can slide between them. A 9-ton gate balanced so precisely on a single axle that it could be opened with a fingertip. A telescope carved from coral that aligns with the North Star. Every surface carries the fingerprint of obsession and of love. Because at its heart, Coral Castle wasn't a scientific experiment. It was a love letter carved in stone. Edward named it Rock Gate Park for his lost fiancée, Agnes. Some visitors say the whole place feels like a monument to longing, built not to impress the world, but to speak to one absent heart. And yet, beneath the romance lies a riddle that science still hasn't solved. How did one man weighing barely 100 pounds move 30-ton stones with such grace? Engineers propose clever theories: levers, counterweights, secrecy. But every explanation feels smaller than the mystery itself. Standing among the coral walls, as sunlight drips through the gaps, it's easy to imagine something unseen at work. The stones seem weightless in their silence, as if still remembering the night they were lifted. Edward Leeds-Kalnin never sought fame, and perhaps that's why his secret survived him. When asked once whether he believed in magic, he shook his head. "No," he said, "I know how the world works. Others have forgotten." And maybe that's the real heart of Coral Castle. Not proof of levitation, but proof of devotion. A reminder that some forces, whether love or gravity, yield not to power, but to patience. In the quiet English countryside of the 1960s, an engineer named John Searl began to dream in circles. He was a modest man, a technician with a curious mind and a fascination for magnets. While others saw static objects that repelled and attracted, Searl saw motion. He imagined magnets arranged in such perfect balance that they could move endlessly, drawing energy from their own geometry. He called his invention the Searl effect generator, or simply the SEG. It consisted of concentric magnetic rings, each surrounded by a set of rollers that orbited like planets. When activated, the rollers would begin to spin of their own accord, faster and faster, until the entire device seemed to come alive. Then something even stranger happened. The air grew cold, a soft hum filled the room, and the machine began to rise. Witnesses, neighbors, journalists, even a few skeptical scientists described the same thing: the SEG levitating, glowing faintly at the edges, and hovering silently before drifting upward. And all the while, it was producing electricity. Free, clean, continuous power. To Searl, this was no mystery. The magnets, he said, were arranged to follow a harmonic law, a natural resonance between energy and motion. The universe, he explained, works in waves and cycles. I just made a machine that listens to it. For a few years, his demonstrations drew quiet excitement. His generator-powered lights and tools without fuel, and his small flying discs, scaled-up versions of the SEG, seemed to defy gravity itself. But when British authorities intervened, everything changed. They accused him of violating energy regulations and causing electrical interference with aircraft navigation. His lab was raided, his equipment confiscated, his research destroyed. Searl spent time in prison for what were officially electrical code violations. Unofficially, it was the end of his work. When he was released, the devices were gone, his notes scattered. What remained were only stories, and one man's unbroken conviction that he had touched a deeper law of nature. Over the decades, the legend of John Searl took on a life of its own. Some called him a visionary, others a fraud. Yet even his detractors admitted there was something odd about his results. Engineers who tried to replicate his work found strange magnetic behaviors, fleeting effects that didn't fit the textbooks. Searl, for his part, never gave up. Even in old age, he kept designing new versions of the SAG, still convinced that magnetism held the key to unlimited power, and perhaps even to flight among the stars. His story, like many of the dreamers before him, is less about proof than persistence. He once said, "The laws of nature are generous, but they don't give their secrets to those who seek profit. Only to those who seek understanding." In that statement lies both his triumph and his undoing. Whether or not the SEG truly worked may matter less than what it represented. The idea that the Earth itself hums with unseen potential, that power might not be something we take from the world, but something we learn to resonate with. Standing beside one of his old dented rings, now resting in a museum case, its metal dulled with age, you can almost imagine it whispering, waiting to spin again. Perhaps the future Searl imagined is still turning somewhere, quietly, like a circle that never stopped. Most engines are creatures of violence. They burn, explode, and consume. But one man, an Austrian forester named Victor Schauberger, believed the world ran on gentler laws. To him, nature didn't explode, it imploded. Born in 1885 among the forests and mountain streams of Upper Austria, Schauberger spent his youth studying the movement of water, its spirals, its quiet intelligence. He noticed how trout could remain motionless in a raging current, how vortexes seemed to pull energy inward rather than push it out. "Comprehend and copy nature," he would say. That is the key. By the 1930s, Schauberger began building machines based on what he called implosion technology, devices that used vortex motion to generate power. Instead of explosions chaos, implosion created harmony, concentrating energy rather than scattering it. His repulsine engine, a brass disc-shaped device with internal spiral channels, appeared to create thrust by sucking in air, spinning it into vortices, and producing lift without combustion. Witnesses described it as eerily quiet. It cooled as it ran, glowing with a faint blue corona. Some said it seemed to breathe, like a mechanical organism inhaling energy from the ether. During World War II, German officials took notice. Schauberger was ordered to work on secret propulsion projects, exploring his implosion designs for military aircraft. He complied reluctantly, seeing his life's work twisted toward destruction. After the war, American intelligence forces seized his notes and prototypes. He was interrogated for months, his technology classified, his engines dismantled. When he was finally released, he was broken, but not defeated. "They stole my life's work," he said, "but not my understanding." In 1958, a group of American businessmen invited Schauberger to the United States, promising to develop his engines for peaceful use. He came, weary but hopeful. But what awaited him, however, was another kind of imprisonment. Contracts that stripped him of ownership and forbade him from building independently. Within months, he realized he had been used. He returned to Austria, disillusioned, and died soon after. Yet his ideas refused to die. Today, scientists studying fluid dynamics and renewable energy cite Schauberger's insights into vortex motion, water revitalization, and natural flow systems. His principles of implosion, of drawing energy inward, of cooperation instead of domination, feel strangely relevant in an age of exhaustion. If Tesla sought to harness the lightning of the heavens, Schauberger sought to listen to the whisper of rivers. His machines were metaphors as much as mechanisms, reminders that power need not be violent to be real. He once wrote, "The true scientist is not a conqueror of nature, but her servant." It is tempting to see Schauberger as another victim of suppression, a visionary crushed between politics and profit. But perhaps his true legacy lies in the vision itself, that life's deepest forces are not explosions, but implosions, not force, but flow. Stand beside a stream on a quiet morning, and you may see it, the water curling inward, spiraling beneath the surface, gathering strength from its own motion. Schauberger would have smiled at that, the simple beauty of a truth that no one could seize or patent. He believed that one day our machines would mimic that grace, that humanity would stop fighting nature and start listening to her. And maybe, if we do, the engines of the future will breathe not with fire, but with the same quiet rhythm as a river returning home to the sea. It was 1943, the height of war. The U.S. Navy, desperate for advantage, turned to science for what it had always promised: miracles. At the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, under a haze of secrecy, the destroyer USS Eldridge waited. Cables snaked across the deck, connecting massive electromagnetic generators the size of small buildings. The experiment's official aim was modest enough: radar invisibility. But what happened that October day would enter the folklore of physics as one of the strangest stories of the century. Witnesses described a blinding flash of blue-green light, followed by silence. The ship, they said, simply vanished, gone from the harbor as if erased from existence. Minutes later, it reappeared hundreds of miles away near Norfolk, Virginia, before vanishing again and returning to its original berth. The men aboard were not the same. Some staggered, disoriented, their skin tinged with radiation burns. Others spoke of sensations of falling through light, of seeing time ripple like water. A few, the accounts claimed, were fused into the ship's metal bulkheads, frozen mid-motion. Whether the Philadelphia experiment truly occurred or was a distortion of classified research, its myth has persisted for generations. At its heart lies a question that haunts both science and imagination. Can the fabric of reality be folded, even briefly, by human hands? According to rumor, the experiment drew on the unfinished theories of Albert Einstein's unified field, an attempt to link gravity and electromagnetism into one continuous force. By generating powerful electromagnetic fields, researchers hoped to bend light around the ship, rendering it invisible. But what if, instead, they bent space itself? Officially, the Navy denied everything. No such experiment, they insisted, ever took place. Yet letters, testimonies, and fragments of reports surfaced for decades afterward, too contradictory to confirm, too vivid to dismiss. Dr. Morris Jessup, an astronomer who investigated the claims, received mysterious correspondence from a man who said he had served aboard the Eldridge. The letters described sailors who walked through walls, men who moved between moments. Jessup pursued the truth until his own life ended abruptly in what was ruled a suicide. Perhaps it was all misinterpretation, ordinary tests exaggerated by rumor, electrical discharges mistaken for teleportation. But the persistence of the tale points to something deeper than fact, the human fascination with crossing boundaries we were never meant to cross. The Philadelphia experiment endures because it captures the essence of our scientific ambition, the longing to go beyond sight, beyond distance, beyond time, and the fear that doing so may cost us something essential. If it happened, it was less a triumph than a warning. Technology, after all, can expand faster than our understanding. The sailors on the Eldridge, real or imagined, stand as metaphors for us all. Passengers aboard a vessel we are forever trying to steer. Through an ocean of forces we barely comprehend, every generation flirts with invisibility, with teleportation, with rewriting the rules, and each time we come back changed. Somewhere between history and myth, the Eldridge still sails, an echo in the electromagnetic hum of the modern age, a ghost ship reminding us that the line between invention and transcendence is thinner than we think. When you step back from these stories, the towers and microscopes, the levitating metals and whispering engines, a pattern begins to take shape. Not a conspiracy exactly, but a rhythm. A quiet, repeating refrain that hums beneath the march of progress. It is the sound of forgetting. Every age has its dreamers, those who look at the world and see not what is, but what might be. And every age, too, has its gatekeepers, the institutions, markets, and hierarchies that decide which visions fit within the acceptable order of things. When those two collide, invention often gives way to silence. Tesla's tower, Rife's microscope, Brown's gravity, Keely's music, Reich's energy, Schauberger's river, all different melodies, yet all share the same final note. Disappearance. Some call it suppression, others self-destruction. But perhaps it's something simpler and sadder, a world that can't bear to change too fast. Free energy threatens the economy. A simple cure undermines an empire. A machine that listens to nature rather than burns it confuses those raised on combustion and control. Progress, we like to believe, is cumulative, yet history shows it is also selective. We advance not by discovering everything, but by deciding what not to remember. Sometimes erasure is deliberate, sealed patents, seized notebooks, classified vaults. Other times it's emotional, ridicule, neglect, the slow suffocation of ideas that don't fit the narrative of reason. Civilization, like a cautious editor, crosses out the lines it finds too strange, too beautiful, too inconvenient. Still, the evidence lingers. A blueprint in a forgotten archive, a demonstration no one could fully explain, a stone gate that swings on perfect balance after 70 years. These fragments whisper that perhaps our understanding of impossible is merely temporary. There is another pattern, too, a human one. Each inventor began with the same impulse, curiosity unbound by reward. Tesla sought light for all, Rife sought healing, Schauberger sought harmony. None of them asked for power, they sought connection. Yet, inevitably, their discoveries threatened existing powers. That tension between imagination and ownership may be the oldest story in science. Because progress isn't just measured in what we build, but in what we're willing to share. And sharing, as history reminds us, often carries a cost. When knowledge becomes dangerous, it rarely disappears overnight. It fades. First, the funding stops. Then the journals close their doors. The language itself changes. Fringe, pseudoscience, myth. Finally, the idea becomes a story told in the dim corners of curiosity, where believers and skeptics trade echoes of a past that almost was. But stories have their own endurance. They persist where data cannot. They pass from one generation to the next, disguised as legend, until someone, somewhere, decides to listen again. And perhaps that is the truest form of resurrection, not in laboratories or patents, but in memory. So when we speak of inventions erased from history, maybe we're also speaking of our own selective sight, the human tendency to look away from miracles that don't fit our equations. Forgetting is not always the work of censors. Sometimes it's the defense mechanism of a species still afraid of its own potential. The pattern of erasure, then, is not just about the past. It's about us, about how much wonder we're willing to tolerate before we start reaching for the eraser. There's a story, half truth, half allegory, that somewhere beneath the Nevada desert, in a temperature-controlled bunker, sit shelves lined with sealed trunks. They hold blueprints, glass tubes, handwritten notebooks, fragments of machines that once glowed, floated, or sang. The names on the tags are familiar. Tesla, Rife, Brown, Reich, Schauberger. Maybe it's only a myth. Or maybe it's a symbol of something much larger, the vaults we build, both literal and psychological, to contain the things we're not ready to face. In every generation, knowledge has been hidden as much as it has been discovered. sometimes to protect nations, sometimes to protect profits, sometimes simply to protect certainty. The classified archives of science are like shadow libraries of human imagination, repositories not of monsters but of maybes. The Inventions Secrecy Act of 1951 still exists, quietly renewed each year. Thousands of patents remain locked under national security orders, energy devices, propulsion systems, communications breakthroughs. The official justification is safety. The unofficial one is control. What would happen, after all, if power became too cheap, too decentralized, too free? But the vault isn't only governmental. It lives in universities that turn away research that strays from accepted theory. It lives in corporations that bury their own innovations to preserve old revenue streams. It lives in each of us when skepticism hardens into dismissal. We tell ourselves that secrets protect us from chaos. Yet sometimes they simply protect our habits. Inside those hidden vaults, whether made of steel or silence, lies more than technology. What's really stored there are alternate futures, paths not taken, civilizations that might have been cleaner, freer, perhaps even kinder. When we lock them away, we aren't just erasing inventions, we're editing our own possibilities. Still, the vault can't stay closed forever. Ideas, like seeds, have their own patience. They wait for cracks in the concrete, for moments when culture shifts and curiosity slips through. What was once impossible becomes inevitable the moment someone rediscovers how to ask the right question. Every so often, a fragment escapes, a rediscovered manuscript, a forgotten patent resurfacing online. A hobbyist rebuilding a long-lost experiment in a garage lit by the same stubborn wonder that drove its creator. And when that happens, we're reminded that suppression is never complete. Knowledge, like water, finds a way. The image of the hidden vaults endures because it speaks to something universal. The belief that truth, however buried, remains alive somewhere, waiting for light. It comforts us to imagine that humanity's best ideas haven't been destroyed, merely delayed. But there's another interpretation, quieter and perhaps more honest, that the real vault is time itself, and that we are both the keepers and the key holders. Every rediscovery begins when someone chooses curiosity over cynicism, openness over fear. That's when the lock turns. If those fabled trunks beneath the desert truly exist, perhaps they don't hold blueprints or devices at all. Perhaps they hold something rarer, the unfinished dreams of people who believed the world could be better than it was. And maybe, just maybe, the vault was never meant to be opened by force, but by faith, by the slow, collective awakening of a species finally willing to imagine again. What remains when the machines are gone, when the blueprints have faded, and the inventors themselves are dust? Perhaps only a question, one that hums quietly beneath all the noise of progress. What if we had listened? Across a century of forgotten laboratories, from Tesla's electric storms to Schauberger's spiraling rivers, one truth threads through every vanished experiment. Each of these men believed that the world was more generous than we imagine. They saw nature not as a puzzle to dominate, but as a partner, an orchestra of hidden harmonies waiting for someone to join in tune. And maybe that was their undoing, because to see abundance in a world built on scarcity is to become dangerous. To imagine power without profit, healing without cost, energy without consumption, it challenges more than industries. It challenges the architecture of our civilization. But erasure is never final. The ideas we bury have a strange way of resurfacing. They echo in today's breakthroughs: wireless charging, resonance imaging, sustainable energy fields, quantum biology. Each is a distant descendant of something once dismissed as impossible. The light, it seems, always finds another filament. Still, there is something profoundly human in the way we lose and rediscover our own imagination. We are creatures of both wonder and caution. We build towers to touch the sky, then tear them down when the lightning grows too bright. We speak of innovation but fear disruption. We crave truth yet find comfort in mystery. Maybe that's what progress truly is. Not a straight line, but a pendulum. We swing toward revelation, then back toward restraint, learning and unlearning, daring and retreating. Each forgotten invention is a moment when humanity blinked, too startled by its own reflection in the light of possibility. And yet these stories endure. They move quietly through time like constellations, visible only to those who look up long enough to notice. They remind us that history is not a ledger of facts, but a field of seeds. Some sprout in laboratories, others sleep for decades, waiting for gentler hands. When we call these inventions erased, perhaps what we mean is that they slipped beneath the current of our collective readiness. Maybe the world wasn't prepared for free energy, or healing through resonance, or gravity that yields to electricity. But someday we might be. The future doesn't destroy the past. It redeems it. Every rediscovery is an apology to those who came before, to the dreamers who built machines the world wasn't ready to believe in. In the end, what lingers is not the suppression, but the yearning, the audacious hope that there is more to reality than we can measure. That somewhere, beneath the hum of wires and the weight of skepticism, the universe still waits to be heard. Tesla once wrote, "The present is theirs. The future for which I really worked is mine." Perhaps the same could be said for all of them. Their towers may have fallen, their engines silenced, their names half forgotten, but the dream remains, that one day humanity might choose curiosity over fear, wonder over profit, and understanding over control. And when that day comes, maybe we'll finally hear it again, the faint hum beneath the silence, the vibration that unites all things, the light that might have been and still could be.